The darkness before dawn on that particular Tuesday in early June carried with it a peculiar quality of silence that Klaus Richter would remember for the rest of his life. As an Oberleutnant in the 352nd Artillery Regiment, he had experienced many pre-dawn watches along the Normandy coastline, but this one possessed an atmosphere he couldn't quite identify at first. A dense fog had rolled in from the English Channel during the night, wrapping the coastal fortifications in a blanket of grey dampness that seemed to muffle every sound, every sensation. The temperature had dropped enough that his breath formed small clouds in the air before him, and the perpetual smell of the sea, that mixture of salt and organic decay, filled his nostrils with each inhalation. The time was approximately 5 o'clock in the morning when Richter positioned himself at his usual observation point. His shift had begun in the ordinary way, with the routine checks and the familiar rhythm of military procedure that had governed his life for so many years. At 32 years of age, he occupied that uncomfortable middle ground between the idealistic young soldiers who still believed in the invincibility of the Reich and the aging veterans who had seen too much to believe in anything anymore. He had survived the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front, had witnessed things that changed a man fundamentally, and had developed the kind of pragmatic outlook that comes from watching grand strategies collapse under the weight of reality. His command consisted of an artillery battery positioned several miles inland from what the enemy would later designate as Omaha Beach. The guns themselves were Czech-made cannons of solid construction, housed within concrete casements that had been built as part of the much-publicized Atlantic Wall. From where he stood now, in a concrete bunker that had been sunk deep into a high bluff overlooking the water, he enjoyed an unobstructed view of the Channel. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the routine had been identical. His men would drill endlessly, calculating firing solutions with mathematical precision, maintaining their weapons with Germanic thoroughness, and staring out at the grey emptiness of the water, waiting for something that might never come. The invasion was always discussed, of course. Der Tag X, they called it, the Day of Days. It was the phantom that haunted every conversation, every strategic meeting, every moment of downtime when men allowed their minds to wander. The question was never whether it would come, but when and where. German intelligence, with the confidence that only institutional bureaucracy can produce, had determined that the primary assault would target Calais. It made perfect strategic sense. The distance across the Channel was shorter there, the route into Germany more direct. The defences around Calais had been reinforced accordingly, while other sections of the Atlantic Wall, including Richter's position, received less attention and fewer resources. Richter had his doubts, though he kept them mostly to himself. He had been a soldier long enough to understand that reality and strategy often diverged in unexpected ways. The young men under his command, many of them conscripts who had never seen combat, possessed a naive faith in the fortress they occupied. They believed in the propaganda that portrayed the Atlantic Wall as an impenetrable barrier, a masterwork of engineering that would shatter any invasion attempt like waves breaking against rocks. Richter, who had commanded men in desperate defensive battles on the frozen steppes of Russia, knew better. He understood the difference between what propaganda declared and what concrete and steel could actually accomplish. The Atlantic Wall itself was more concept than reality in many places. Yes, there were impressive fortifications at key points, bunkers with thick walls and commanding fields of fire. But between these strong points stretched long expanses of coastline where defences were incomplete, where minefields had gaps large enough to drive a truck through, where the various fortified positions could be isolated and overwhelmed one at a time. Richter had walked the local area extensively during his time in Normandy. He had noted the shortcuts that local farmers still used to move between fields, the dead zones where observation was impossible, the weaknesses that any competent attacking force would identify and exploit. The weeks leading up to this particular June morning had been marked by escalating tension. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had been tasked with strengthening the coastal defences, and he had attacked the assignment with characteristic energy. Rommel understood something that the comfortable strategists in Berlin seemed unable to grasp. If the Allies established a foothold on the beaches, if they managed to get their men and equipment ashore in substantial numbers, then the war in the West was effectively finished. Allied air superiority was absolute. Any German reinforcements attempting to move toward the coast during daylight hours would be annihilated from the air before they could reach the battlefield. The invasion had to be defeated on the beaches themselves in the first hours, or it could not be defeated at all. Under Rommel's direction, millions of mines had been laid. Thousands upon thousands of steel obstacles had been planted in the tidal zones, wicked structures designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The soldiers had nicknamed them Rommel's asparagus, and they had devoted countless hours to installing them in the sand and surf. Concrete had been poured, guns had been positioned, firing lanes had been cleared. The whole operation had the feel of men preparing for an examination they knew they might fail, working desperately to shore up weaknesses before time ran out. Then, on the 5th of June, the weather had turned dramatically for the worse. A storm system had moved in with surprising speed, bringing high winds and rough seas that made the channel dangerous even for experienced sailors. The German Meteorological Service, staffed by competent professionals using the best available methods, had analysed the conditions and delivered their verdict with confidence. An invasion would be impossible for several days at minimum. The seas were too rough, the visibility too poor, the conditions too dangerous for the kind of massive amphibious operation that everyone knew must be coming eventually. This forecast had a profound effect on the German command structure. Senior officers who had been maintaining high alert for weeks suddenly felt justified in relaxing their vigilance. Some left their posts to attend to other matters. Rommel himself, trusting the meteorological assessment, had departed France entirely to return to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm, it seemed, had bought them a brief reprieve. The weather would keep them safe for a few more days, time enough to catch their breath, to rest, to prepare for the next round of waiting. So when Richter took his position in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, the general mood was one of routine procedure rather than high alert. The storm had passed through, leaving behind choppy seas and lingering poor visibility, but nothing that seemed immediately threatening. The watch was just another watch, the day just another day in the long string of days that made up military life. No one expected anything unusual. No one was looking for trouble. Richter had positioned himself facing east, toward where the sun would eventually rise and burn away the morning fog. He was thinking about nothing in particular, his mind in that neutral state that comes from performing familiar duties by rote when something caught his attention. It was subtle at first, just a slight irregularity in the uniform greyness of the fog-shrouded sea. He blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the dim light. The irregularity remained. If anything, it seemed to be growing more distinct. He reached for his binoculars, a fine pair of Zeiss optics that were one of the small privileges of his rank. Bringing them to his eyes, he adjusted the focus and scanned the area where he had noticed the anomaly. His heart, which had been beating in the slow, steady rhythm appropriate for an early morning watch, suddenly began to accelerate. What he was seeing made no sense. It couldn't be what it appeared to be. He lowered the binoculars, rubbed his eyes hard with his free hand, and looked again with the naked eye. The irregularity was still there, and it was definitely growing larger. He raised the binoculars once more and forced himself to focus carefully, methodically, the way he had been trained. What he saw through the magnified lenses made his blood turn to ice in his veins. Ships. But not a few ships on a patrol, not a small raiding force attempting some limited objective. Ships in numbers that his mind initially refused to accept as real. He swept the binoculars slowly from left to right, and everywhere he looked the view was the same. The horizon, which should have been empty water meeting empty sky, was instead a solid mass of dark shapes stretching as far as he could see in either direction. The initial shock gave way to a desperate need to quantify what he was seeing, to reduce it to numbers that his military training could process and report. He tried to count individual vessels, but it was immediately clear that such an effort was pointless. There were simply too many of them, packed too closely together. His brain, operating on instinct and years of professional experience, began automatically categorizing what he could see. There were capital ships out there, big ones, battleships and heavy cruisers whose massive silhouettes were distinctive even at this distance. Around them moved smaller, faster shapes, destroyers probably, circling in protective patterns. And then there were the others, the countless others, the landing craft and transports and supply ships that seemed to fill every available square metre of ocean. He continued scanning with the binoculars, his hands beginning to tremble slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. The sheer scale of what he was witnessing went beyond anything he had imagined possible. German intelligence estimates, which he had seen during briefings, had suggested that the Allies might be able to assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion. That had seemed like an enormous number, almost unbelievable in itself. What he was looking at now made those estimates seem laughably inadequate. This wasn't just larger than expected. It was a completely different order of magnitude. As the minutes passed and the light slowly improved, more details became visible. He could make out individual types of vessels now, could see the way they were organized into groups, could observe the purposeful movement as the massive fleet continued its approach toward the French coast. History would later record that the complete Allied armada for the Normandy invasion consisted of nearly 7,000 vessels drawn from 8 different nations, making it the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled before or since. But Richter didn't have access to those future statistics. All he had was the view through his binoculars and the growing, crushing realization that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of warfare. The professional part of his mind, the part that had been trained in military operations and strategic thinking, tried to process the implications. This wasn't just an invasion force. It was a demonstration of industrial and logistical capability on a scale that rendered previous assumptions about warfare obsolete. Germany had spent years building fortifications, the Atlantic Wall that stretched from Norway to Spain. The Allies had responded by building something far more impressive, a bridge of steel and determination that could carry an entire army across the English Channel and deposit it directly onto the beaches of France. His hands were definitely shaking now as he grabbed for the field telephone. The device felt slippery in his sweating palms as he cranked the handle to establish connection. The line crackled and a tired voice answered from somewhere down the chain of command. Richter tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but he could hear the strain in his own words as he identified himself and his position. "This is Oberleutnant Richter at Observation Post 4, he said, each word carefully enunciated. "I have visual contact with the English Channel. There are ships approaching." The voice on the other end sounded annoyed at being disturbed, dismissive in the way that comes from dealing with false alarms and nervous subordinates. "We have received some reports of possible vessels in the area, Oberleutnant. Probably a limited raid or reconnaissance in force. Maintain observation and stand by for further orders." The casual dismissal, the obvious assumption that he was overreacting to something minor, snapped something inside Richter. He found himself nearly shouting into the telephone, abandoning the careful professional tone. "You don't understand what I'm telling you. This is not a few ships. This is not a raid. There are thousands of them. Thousands. The entire channel is covered from one side of my field of vision to the other. This is the invasion. The invasion is happening right now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Richter could almost hear the mental gears turning as the officer tried to process what was being reported. The response, when it came, was skeptical, the voice of a man who has been told something too extraordinary to accept at face value. "Oberleutnant, our meteorological service has determined that sea conditions are not suitable for large-scale operations. Our intelligence indicates that any major action is unlikely at this time. Are you certain of what you are seeing?" Richter felt a surge of frustration so intense it was almost physically painful. The evidence was right there in front of him, undeniable to anyone with functioning eyes, and yet the system, the bureaucracy, The comfortable certainty of official reports and expert assessments was preventing the truth from being heard and accepted. "Your meteorological service is wrong," he said, his voice cracking with the strain. "Your intelligence is wrong. I am looking at it with my own eyes right now. The sea is covered with ships. For God's sake, send someone up here to look at the channel. Just look at it." He slammed the telephone handset down harder than necessary, the plastic casing making a sharp crack against the metal cradle. The dismissive response had shaken him almost as much as the sight of the fleet itself. How could they not believe him? How could they hear what he was telling them and still cling to their weather reports and their comfortable assumptions? He grabbed the telephone again, this time calling directly to regimental headquarters, bypassing the intermediate levels of command that had proven so useless. When his commanding officer came on the line, Richter didn't waste time with elaborate explanations. He kept it simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet has arrived. I estimate at minimum 10,000 ships currently visible from my observation post." He knew even as he said it that 10,000 was an exaggeration, that his mind was inflating the numbers in response to the shock and the fear. But in that moment, it felt less like an exaggeration than an understatement. The actual number, whatever it was, hardly mattered. What mattered was the fundamental reality of what was happening. The Major's voice carried a note of alarm now, but also doubt, the natural skepticism of a senior officer confronted with a report that contradicts everything he has been told to expect. "Richter, are you absolutely certain of this? The weather conditions were supposed to prevent any large-scale operations for several more days." "Sir," Richter replied, his voice now completely calm. The calmness that comes after panic has exhausted itself and left only acceptance in its wake. "The weather has cleared sufficiently for me to see what is quite possibly the end of the world, and it is currently sailing toward us across the English Channel. I am requesting permission to commence firing." This time the urgency in his voice must have penetrated, must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because the Major's tone changed immediately. The bureaucratic skepticism fell away, replaced by the clipped efficiency of a soldier accepting that battle has been joined. "Very well," the Major said. "I am elevating this report to division. Prepare your battery for action. I will get you confirmation as quickly as possible." But Richter didn't wait for official confirmation. He couldn't afford to wait. Every minute of delay was a minute the massive fleet drew closer to the beaches, closer to the point where his guns would become irrelevant. He began shouting orders to his men, his voice cutting through the early morning quiet like a knife. The soldiers, roused from their various states of drowsiness and inattention, responded with the automatic efficiency of trained troops. They moved to their positions, their faces still showing confusion about what was happening, why the sudden urgency. Then some of them reached positions where they could see the channel, and their expressions changed completely. The confusion vanished, replaced by something that Richter recognized because he had felt it himself just minutes earlier. It was the look of men confronting something that their minds were not prepared to accept, something so far outside the normal range of experience that it seemed almost supernatural. The ocean, which should have been empty or nearly so, was instead packed with ships so densely that in places the dark hulls seemed to touch each other. Some of the younger soldiers stood frozen, simply staring. The veterans, the ones who had seen combat before, recovered more quickly and began moving with purposeful urgency. They understood what this meant. They understood that talking was over and that the only thing that mattered now was preparation and action. Heavy shells, each one weighing dozens of kilograms, were brought up from the underground magazines where they had been stored. Men strained and sweated as they manhandled the massive projectiles into position. Rangefinders began calling out distances, their voices crisp and professional despite the circumstances. The great barrels of the cannons, which had been silent for so long except during practice drills, began to elevate slowly, the mechanical systems groaning slightly as they moved the tremendous weight. Richter stood at his observation post, binoculars pressed against his face hard enough to leave marks on his skin, and watched the enemy fleet continue its approach. He could see more details now as the light improved and the distance closed. The landing craft were beginning to form up into organized waves, preparing for their run to the beaches. He could sense, more than hear, a low vibration in the air, a thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the sound of thousands of engines, diesel and gasoline, all running simultaneously, a mechanical symphony that represented more concentrated power than he had ever imagined could exist in one place. The formal order to engage arrived shortly before 6 o'clock in the morning. It came through the telephone line in the form of a terse message from regimental command. All batteries are to commence firing at will. Engage targets of opportunity. May God be with you all. For Richter, the order was almost a relief. The paralysis of observation, the helpless feeling of watching disaster approach without being able to act, was finally broken. Now there was something to do, a concrete task that his training had prepared him for. He grabbed the telephone that connected him directly to the gun crews and spoke with absolute clarity, his voice cutting through the background noise. All guns, commence firing. Target the densest concentrations of vessels. Fire for effect. A moment later, the world erupted. The first cannon fired with a sound that was less heard than felt, a physical punch that hammered through the air and shook the earth beneath Richter's feet. Before the first gun had finished its recoil cycle, the second gun fired, then the third. The battery settled into a steady rhythm, the crews working with the practiced efficiency that came from months of drilling. The bunker filled with the smell of cordite and hot metal. Dust shook loose from the ceiling with each firing. Through his binoculars, Richter tracked the fall of the shells, watching for impacts. The first rounds fell into the water, sending up massive plumes of white spray. Misses, but close enough to demonstrate that the range calculations were approximately correct. The crews adjusted their aim based on the spotting, making tiny corrections to elevation and traverse. The next salvo was better. Richter saw explosions bloom among the tightly packed vessels. Whether they were scoring direct hits or near misses was impossible to determine at this distance, but they were definitely making the enemy uncomfortable. Then came what appeared to be a direct hit on an American destroyer. Through his binoculars, Richter saw a flash of bright orange followed immediately by a thick column of black smoke that rose up from the stricken vessel. The ship, which historical records would later identify as the USS Corrie, seemed to lose power, listing noticeably to one side. Whether it had struck one of Richter's shells or had also hit a mine would be debated later, but from his perspective in that moment, his battery had drawn blood. His guns had struck back against the massive fleet that had appeared from the fog. A ragged cheer went up from his men. They had hit something, damaged something, proven that they were not entirely helpless in the face of this overwhelming force. For a brief span of minutes, it felt like a genuine fight. It felt like their training mattered, like the countless hours of practice and preparation had meaning. They were soldiers doing a soldier's job, and they were doing it well. But the feeling of triumph was desperately short-lived. Richter continued watching the fleet through his binoculars, and what he saw filled him with a cold despair that went deeper than any fear he had experienced in combat. The destroyer they had hit was indeed crippled, smoking and listing, eventually to sink, but the rest of the fleet showed no reaction at all. The tight formations didn't scatter in panic. The advance didn't slow. Ships simply moved to fill the gap left by the damaged vessel, and the vast armada continued its inexorable approach to the shore. It was like trying to stop a flood by throwing stones into it. The gesture was meaningless against the sheer scale of what they faced. His battery continued firing, the crews working themselves into exhaustion as they fed shell after shell into the hungry guns. They were good soldiers, well-trained and professional, and they were giving everything they had. But for every ship they might harass or damage, 100 others sailed past untouched. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. They had a handful of guns. The enemy had thousands of ships. No amount of courage or skill could overcome that kind of numerical disparity. Richter lowered his binoculars for a moment to rest his eyes, and when he looked back at the overall tactical picture, he felt his stomach drop. The Allied battleships, massive vessels mounting guns far larger than anything the Germans had positioned along the coast, were turning broadside to the shore. The barrels of their main batteries were elevating, tracking toward targets on land. He had just enough time to realize what was about to happen before the horizon erupted with light. The reply, when it came, was overwhelming. It began as a rolling thunder from across the water, the sound of dozens of heavy naval guns firing in a coordinated bombardment. He saw the muzzle flashes, brilliant points of light against the grey background of sea and sky, like lightning trapped and weaponized. The shells, each one massive enough to destroy a building, began their arcing flight toward the French coast. There was a brief delay, a handful of seconds in which the laws of physics determined the shell's trajectory, and then the world around Richter's position began to come apart. The impacts were beyond anything he had experienced, even in the desperate battles on the Eastern Front. The ground itself seemed to heave and buckle under the hammering. Massive geysers of earth and rock erupted from the fields behind the coastal fortifications. Trees were shredded into splinters. Entire sections of the landscape simply vanished, replaced by smoking craters large enough to hide a tank. The sound was continuous, overlapping, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself as tons of high explosive reshaped the terrain. This was what modern industrial warfare looked like when one side had absolute material superiority. This was the systematic destruction of defensive positions using resources so abundant that conservation was not a concern. The Allied naval forces were not trying to outmaneuver the German defences or exploit some tactical weakness. They were simply erasing those defences through the application of overwhelming firepower, the way a man might use a sledgehammer to demolish a wooden fence. Richter's mind, even in the midst of this chaos, was asking questions that had no good answers. Where was the German response? Where were the panzer divisions that were supposed to race to the coast and drive the invaders back into the sea? Where was the Luftwaffe, the air force that had once dominated the skies over Europe? He scanned the sky desperately, looking for the familiar shapes of Messerschmitt fighters or Focke-Wulf bombers coming to attack the invasion fleet. What he saw instead made his despair complete. The sky was full of aircraft, thousands of them, but they were all Allied planes. Fighters swept back and forth in elaborate patterns, establishing air superiority so complete that not a single German aircraft challenged them. Bombers flew in steady streams toward targets inland. Transport aircraft towed gliders full of airborne troops. The Allies didn't just own the air over Normandy, they owned it so completely that they could operate as if the Luftwaffe didn't exist at all. The historical statistics would later confirm what Richter could see with his own eyes. On D-Day, the Allies flew more than 14,000 air sorties. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300. For every single German plane that managed to get airborne, there were more than 40 Allied aircraft in the sky. It wasn't air superiority, it was air supremacy of a kind that rendered traditional defensive tactics meaningless. The reason for this disparity wasn't some failure of German courage or skill, it was factories. While German aircraft production struggled with shortages of fuel, aluminum, and skilled workers, the American industrial base was turning out planes at a rate that seemed physically impossible. The numbers were almost obscene in their abundance. Boeing factories in Seattle running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Lockheed plants in California, where workers produced a new fighter every few hours. The British had their own production lines running at maximum capacity. The combined output of the Allied nations was a tidal wave of steel and aluminum that the German aviation industry had no hope of matching. And then there were the tanks, the armoured vehicles that were supposed to be Germany's ace in the whole. Richter knew the reputation of German armour. The Tiger and Panther tanks were technological marvels, feared by Allied tankers for good reason. They had thicker armour, more powerful guns, better optics. In a one-on-one engagement, a Tiger tank was almost certainly superior to an American Sherman, but that superiority, impressive as it was on paper, meant nothing in the face of the production numbers. The mathematics were devastating. For every Tiger tank that rolled off a German production line, the Americans were producing dozens of Shermans. German industry in 1944, even working at maximum capacity under constant Allied bombing, could never manage more than about 2,000 tanks per month at its absolute peak. The United States alone, not counting British or Soviet production, was building more than 29,000 tanks that year. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through superior quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under an avalanche of good enough armour, accepting that they might lose 3 or 4 Shermans for every Tiger they destroyed and still come out ahead because they had 3 or 4 more Shermans behind those, and 3 or 4 more behind those, stretching back to factories that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. This was the fundamental equation that Richter was confronting, standing in his observation post while the naval bombardment continued to tear the world apart around him. All the talk of German willpower, of ideological strength, of the superiority of a united, determined people over decadent democracies, it all dissolved into meaninglessness in the face of these brutal industrial facts. Nazi ideology had promised that determination and racial purity would triumph over materialism and diversity. But ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Determination didn't make artillery shells materialize out of thin air. He and his men were excellent soldiers. They were brave, well-trained, experienced, professional. And none of it mattered because they weren't being outfought. They were being outnumbered and outproduced on a scale that made tactical considerations irrelevant. They were participants in a conflict where the outcome had already been determined by production charts and shipping manifests, by the output of factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Birmingham, by an economic system that could mobilize resources on a scale that Germany had never been able to match. The propaganda posters back home showed determined German soldiers holding the line against overwhelming odds, promised that final victory was inevitable through sheer force of will. But Richter understood now that it was all a lie, and not just a political lie or a morale-boosting exaggeration. It was a mathematical lie, a fundamental misrepresentation of reality. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the intelligence reports, must have understood the production figures, must have realized that they were sending millions of men to fight a war that could not possibly be won. The question that haunted Richter was whether they had deceived themselves first, or whether they had known from the beginning that they were sending soldiers to die for a cause that was already lost. It was no wonder that in the final year of the war, as the truth became impossible to ignore, the rate of suicide among German officers had climbed dramatically. They weren't just fighting soldiers from America and Britain and Canada. They were fighting the full, unrestricted productive capacity of the global industrial economy, and the realization of just how outmatched they were could break even strong men. As the sun continued its climb into the morning sky, the theoretical discussions about industrial capacity became brutally concrete reality. The naval bombardment reached a sustained intensity that seemed impossible to maintain, a continuous rolling thunder that never paused, never slackened. The concrete walls of Richter's bunker vibrated continuously. Dust and debris fell from the ceiling in a constant rain. Through the narrow observation slit, through gaps in the smoke and dust, he could see the first waves of landing craft reaching the shoreline below his position. The Higgins boats, those flat-bottomed craft specifically designed for amphibious assault, drove straight up onto the sand. Their front ramps dropped, and American soldiers poured out into the surf and onto the beach. The German defensive positions, the machine gun nests and rifle pits that had been prepared specifically for this moment, opened fire immediately. The defending troops from the 352nd Infantry Division, men who had been told for months that this day would come, did their duty with grim professionalism. The machine guns began their terrible work, cutting down the first men to reach the beach, and then the next wave, and the next. From his elevated vantage point, Richter could see the full scope of the slaughter. The water along Omaha Beach was turning red with blood. Bodies piled up in the surf and on the sand. The Americans were being pinned down by murderous fire from the commanding heights. For a brief time it looked like the defences might actually hold, like all the preparation and all the fortification might actually accomplish what it was meant to accomplish. The landing craft kept coming, but the men inside them were being cut down before they could organise an effective assault. It was a massacre, and the German defenders were winning. But then, once again, the industrial equation asserted itself with overwhelming force. Richter watched in fascination and horror as Allied destroyers began to manoeuvre in ways that seemed suicidal. Seeing the carnage on the beaches, seeing their infantry pinned down and dying, the destroyer captains made a decision that would prove decisive. They steamed directly toward the shore, abandoning the safety of deeper water, deliberately moving into ranges where they could be engaged by coastal guns. Some of these ships came so close to shore that they scraped their hulls on underwater sandbars. They were making themselves targets, taking enormous risks, all to get close enough to provide direct fire support to the infantry. The destroyers turned their 5-inch guns on the German bunkers and pillboxes, firing over open sights at ranges where they could hardly miss. The concrete fortifications that had seemed so formidable, that had been designed to resist artillery fire, began to crumble under the concentrated bombardment. Machine gun positions were buried under shell impacts. Observation posts were blown apart. The systematic German defensive fire began to slacken as positions were destroyed or suppressed. At the same time, strange vehicles began to appear on the beaches, machines that Richter had never seen before and could not immediately identify. There were trucks that seemed to drive directly out of the ocean and onto the sand, amphibious vehicles that moved from water to land with equal ease. There were tanks equipped with massive rotating drums on their fronts, flails that beat the ground as the tanks advanced, detonating mines before the main vehicle reached them. There were tanks with bridges mounted on their chassis, tanks with flamethrowers, tanks with specialised equipment for breaching obstacles. These were Hobart's funnies, as the British called them, specialised armoured vehicles that had been developed specifically to overcome the kinds of defences that the Germans had built. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their doctrine had focused on conventional defensive tactics, on positioning good troops with good weapons in strong fortifications and expecting that to be sufficient. But the Allies had studied the problem of amphibious assault with the methodical thoroughness of engineers solving a technical challenge, and they had developed specialised equipment for every obstacle they expected to encounter. It was yet another example of how industrial capacity and systematic planning were overcoming tactical considerations. The battle on Omaha Beach, which had looked like it might fail for the first hour, began to turn inexorably in favour of the attackers. Individual German strongpoints were isolated and methodically destroyed. Naval gunfire, directed by observers on the ground or in aircraft overhead, dropped shells with devastating accuracy on any position that revealed itself by firing. Tanks crawled up the beach, using their guns to suppress defensive positions. Infantry began to move in organised units rather than as scattered individuals. The process was brutal and costly, but it was working. The 352nd Division, which had been defending this sector, was being annihilated. Later estimates would suggest that they suffered somewhere around 1,200 casualties on D-Day itself, a catastrophic percentage of their effective fighting strength eliminated in just a few hours. These weren't just losses that could be replaced easily. These were experienced defenders familiar with their positions and their fields of fire, and once they were gone, there was no one else to take their place. The reserves that might have been used to reinforce the coastal defences were being held back by Hitler's personal order, unable to move without his direct authorization, and Hitler was asleep back in Germany, and his staff were afraid to wake him with bad news. Richter's own battery was now receiving concentrated attention from Allied forces that had identified it as a threat. The naval bombardment that had been general was becoming specific, with shells landing closer and closer to his position. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball climbing into the sky and killed the entire crew instantly. Another gun was knocked out by a near miss that damaged its traversing mechanism. The telephone lines that connected Richter to his subordinate positions went dead one by one, cut by explosions or by the physical destruction of the hardwired communications system. He was being isolated, cut off, his command breaking down into individual positions that could no longer coordinate their fire effectively. He looked up at the sky one last time, hoping against all evidence to see German aircraft coming to the rescue. What he saw instead was a ceiling of Allied planes, layer upon layer of aircraft at different altitudes, all friendly to the invasion force and all hostile to him. On the sea beyond the beaches, the first wave of landing craft had been replaced by a second wave, and that by a third. Behind those waves, the massive fleet waited with what seemed like infinite patience, a conveyor belt of men and material that could apparently run forever without exhausting its supply of either. The statistical reality of what the Allies had accomplished was stunning. They would land approximately 1,500 tanks on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day alone, along with tens of thousands of vehicles and more than 150,000 men. The scale of the logistical operation required to transport and coordinate that many people and that much equipment across the water was staggering. It required a level of organizational capacity and industrial output that Germany had never been able to approach, even at the peak of its power. The battle for the beaches was still being contested with desperate intensity. Men were still dying by the hundreds, but Richter understood that the outcome had already been decided. It was now just a matter of time and tonnage, of the inexorable mathematics of attrition when one side has effectively unlimited resources, and the other side is already operating at the breaking point of its capabilities. The Allies could afford to take casualties. They could afford to lose ships and tanks and aircraft because there were more ships and more tanks and more aircraft waiting behind those, and more being built even as the battle raged. Germany could afford to lose nothing because there was nothing behind what was already committed, and what was being destroyed today could never be replaced. The Battle of Normandy would continue for another 2 brutal months after D-Day. The fighting in the hedgerow country of the Norman interior would be vicious and bloody, a grinding series of small unit actions where the advantages of Allied material superiority were partially negated by terrain and defensive tactics. But that fighting would change nothing about the fundamental trajectory of the campaign. Every German tank that was destroyed represented an irreplaceable loss. Every German soldier killed or captured left a gap in the line that could not be filled. The reinforcements that might have been sent to Normandy were instead being ground up on the Eastern Front against the advancing Soviet army. The fuel that might have allowed mobile defensive operations was trapped in refineries that couldn't deliver it because the transportation infrastructure had been destroyed by Allied bombers. The aircraft that might have contested Allied air superiority were being shot down faster than they could be replaced, and the experienced pilots who were killed couldn't be replaced at all because the training program had been gutted to preserve aviation fuel for combat operations. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and for thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the remainder of the war was nothing more than an extended epilogue to a story whose ending had been written in the industrial output figures of 1943. They fought on because they were soldiers, and that was what soldiers did. They fought on because of duty, or from fear of the consequences of surrender or desertion, or out of a patriotism that had become detached from any rational assessment of reality. But the hope of victory, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6th, burned away by the realization of just how completely outmatched they were. We often conceptualize the end of Nazi Germany as a gradual collapse, a slow grind from June 1944 through to the final battle for Berlin in April and May of 1945. We see it as a process, a series of lost battles and retreating fronts and shrinking territory. But for the men who stood on the Atlantic Wall that morning, for the soldiers who watched an armada of 7,000 ships materialize from the fog, the end came in a single moment of horrifying clarity. It came in the realization that they were not facing an army, but facing the concentrated industrial might of half the world, brought to bear with a single-minded determination to erase them from existence. It was a new kind of warfare, one that wasn't decided by the courage of individual soldiers, or the brilliance of field commanders, or the superiority of specific weapons systems. It was a war that was won and lost in the factories, in the shipyards, in the steel mills and aircraft plants and ammunition depots. It was a war where logistics mattered more than tactics, where production capacity was more important than operational art. For one German artillery officer, standing in a bunker on the coast of Normandy with powerful binoculars pressed to his face, watching a sea that had turned to steel and a sky that had gone dark with enemy aircraft, it was the morning when all the comforting lies fell away and the terrible truth became impossible to ignore. The war was over. Everything that came after was just the bloody process of making that reality official. The hours that followed that first terrible dawn passed in a blur of noise and violence and desperate action. Richter's battery continued firing as long as they had ammunition and functioning guns. Each shot an act of defiance that accomplished nothing except to draw more Allied attention to their position. The bunker that had seemed so solid, so protective, became a trap as the naval bombardment concentrated on eliminating the German artillery positions one by one. The walls, 3 meters of reinforced concrete that was supposed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from the heaviest shells, cracked and shuddered under the sustained pounding. Richter found himself moving between positions almost on autopilot, checking on his surviving crews, making tactical decisions that felt increasingly meaningless in the larger context. One of his sergeants, a veteran named Müller, who had been with him since the Eastern Front, appeared at his side during a brief lull in the bombardment. The man's face was grey with dust and streaked with sweat, his eyes showing the same hollow understanding that Richter felt in his own chest. "Herr Oberleutnant," Müller said, speaking loudly to be heard over the ambient noise of explosions and gunfire. "We've lost guns 3 and 5. Gun 2 has a cracked barrel and isn't safe to fire. We're down to half our ammunition stock. Do you have orders from regiment?" Richter almost laughed at the question. Orders from regiment. As if there were orders that could make sense of this situation. As if there were some tactical doctrine that covered what to do when facing an invasion force that seemed to stretch to infinity. He shook his head, gripping Müller's shoulder for a moment in a gesture of solidarity. "Continue firing as long as we have operational guns and ammunition," he told the sergeant. "Target the landing craft if you can see them. Make them pay for every meter of beach they take. That's all we can do now." Müller nodded, his expression suggesting he understood all the things that Richter wasn't saying. The sergeant moved off to relay the orders, leaving Richter alone with his thoughts for a moment. He returned to his observation position, driven by a compulsion to keep watching, even though what he saw only reinforced his despair. The landing operations were proceeding with mechanical efficiency now that the initial chaos had been overcome. The beaches that had been empty at dawn were now crowded with men and equipment. He could see tanks moving inland, could see columns of infantry advancing in organized formations, could see engineers working to clear obstacles and expand the beachheads. Offshore, the fleet had barely diminished at all. Ships that had discharged their cargo were already heading back across the channel to collect more, while fresh vessels moved in to take their place at the beaches. It was a cycle that could apparently continue indefinitely, limited only by the capacity of the ports and beaches to process the arriving forces. The Allies had clearly given thought to every aspect of this operation, had planned for contingencies and logistics with the kind of thoroughness that characterized their entire approach to the war. Richter thought about his own supply situation in bitter contrast. His battery had started the day with a stockpile of shells that had seemed adequate for any reasonable engagement. They had enough ammunition to sustain fire for several hours at combat rates, which should have been more than sufficient for repelling an attack. But they were already running low, and there was no prospect of resupply. The roads leading to his position were being systematically destroyed by Allied aircraft. Even if ammunition trucks could be spared from other urgent needs, even if they could make the journey, they would be destroyed long before reaching the coast. Every shell his guns fired was one shell closer to the moment when they would fall silent, not because the enemy had destroyed them, but because they had simply run out of ammunition. The American forces on Omaha Beach had by now established themselves firmly enough that they were pushing inland against diminishing resistance. The initial defensive positions had been overwhelmed or abandoned. The troops of the 352nd Division, those who had survived the morning, were falling back in disorder, trying to establish new defensive lines further from the beach where they might have some hope of holding temporarily. But there were no reserves to reinforce them, no fresh troops to replace the casualties, no heavy weapons to replace those that had been destroyed. Richter could see American Sherman tanks advancing up the draws and gullies that led away from the beach, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable. Behind them came more infantry than he could count, spreading out across the landscape in tactical formations that spoke of thorough training and confidence. These were not the desperate, disorganized soldiers of a defeated army. These were professionals doing a job they had practiced extensively, executing a plan that had been refined through multiple rehearsals and exercises. Above the battlefield, the Allied air presence remained absolute. Richter had spotted perhaps 3 German aircraft all day, and all 3 had been shot down within minutes of appearing. The Luftwaffe was simply not capable of contesting the airspace over Normandy. Every time German aircraft tried to approach the invasion zone, they ran into a wall of Allied fighters that outnumbered them so heavily that survival was effectively impossible. The few pilots, brave or foolish enough to make the attempt, were committing suicide for no meaningful tactical gain. As afternoon wore into evening, Richter received fragmentary reports from other positions along the coast. The news was uniformly bad. The Allied landings had succeeded all along the Normandy coastline. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno and Sword beaches had pushed several miles inland. The American paratroopers, who had dropped during the night, scattered and disorganized as they were, had still managed to capture key objectives and were linking up with forces advancing from Utah Beach. Omaha Beach, which had seemed like it might turn into an Allied disaster during those first desperate hours, was now secure enough that engineers were already working on the artificial mulberry harbours that would allow the continuous unloading of supplies even without capturing a major port. The German defensive plan, such as it had been, had failed completely. The Atlantic Wall had been breached in multiple locations. The mobile reserves that were supposed to counterattack and drive the invaders back into the sea were either too far away to reach the battlefield quickly or were being held in place by Hitler's refusal to authorize their movement. The Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's best armoured units, had been ordered to move toward Normandy but was being savaged by Allied aircraft during its approach march. Tanks and vehicles were being destroyed on the roads faster than the division could advance, leaving a trail of burning wreckage across the French countryside. As the sun began to set on that longest day, Richter made a decision that would have been unthinkable 12 hours earlier. His position was untenable. His remaining guns had exhausted their ammunition. His communications with higher headquarters had been cut. His bunker was damaged and could not withstand another sustained bombardment. Staying here would serve no purpose except to guarantee the death or capture of his men. He gave the order to evacuate, to abandon the positions they had occupied and defended, to fall back toward whatever defensive lines might be forming inland. The retreat was conducted in darkness, moving in small groups to avoid Allied air observation. His men moved like ghosts through the devastated landscape, passing through fields that had been peaceful farmland that morning and were now cratered wastelands. They saw burning vehicles, dead soldiers from both sides, destroyed equipment scattered across kilometers of terrain. The scope of the devastation was overwhelming, evidence of the sheer amount of explosive force that had been expended in a single day of combat. They were heading east, away from the coast, when Richter called a brief halt to let his men rest. They had been moving for several hours through difficult terrain, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. He posted sentries and allowed the others to collapse where they stood, too tired to even seek proper cover. Müller appeared beside him again, offering a canteen of water that Richter accepted gratefully. "What happens now, Herr Oberleutnant?" the sergeant asked quietly. The question was simple, but it carried enormous weight. What did happen now? Where were they going? What orders would they receive? What was left to fight for? Richter drank from the canteen, the water cool and clean despite everything, a small reminder that some normal things still existed in the world. He handed the canteen back and looked up at the sky, now fully dark, still faintly illuminated by the glow of fires burning along the coast behind them. "Now we keep going," he said finally. "We find whatever elements of the regiment are still intact. We follow whatever orders we receive. We continue being soldiers because that's what we know how to do." It was an honest answer, but not a complete one. The complete answer, the one he didn't speak aloud, was more complicated and more depressing. Now they would fight a series of delaying actions, trading space for time, falling back from one defensive position to the next as Allied forces expanded their beachhead and brought more men and equipment ashore. They would take casualties that could not be replaced. They would use ammunition and fuel that could not be replenished. They would watch the Reich shrink day by day, kilometre by kilometre, until there was nothing left but rubble and defeat. The Normandy campaign would drag on for weeks after D-Day. The bocage country of the Norman interior, with its thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, would prove ideally suited for defence, allowing German forces to exact a heavy price for every field and village. The fighting would be brutal and close range, the kind of combat where Allied material superiority was partially offset by terrain and by the stubborn professionalism of the defending troops. Individual battles would be won and lost. Ground would be taken and retaken. Casualties on both sides would be heavy. But the ultimate outcome was never in doubt from that first morning when Richter had watched the Armada appear from the fog. The Allies were building up their forces faster than the Germans could bring reinforcements to the front. Every day, more tanks and trucks and artillery pieces came ashore. Every day, fresh divisions arrived to replace units that had been ground down in combat. Every day, the material imbalance became more pronounced and more decisive. The liberation of Cherbourg in late June would give the Allies a major port, dramatically increasing their supply capacity. The breakout from the Normandy hedgerows in late July, Operation Cobra, would shatter the German defensive line and unleash Allied armour into the open country of France. The attempted German counterattack at Mortain in August would fail spectacularly, consuming precious reserves in a futile attempt to cut the American forces in two. The Falaise pocket would close around the remnants of the German forces in Normandy, trapping thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks that could never be replaced. And through all of it, the factories would keep running. The American shipyards would keep launching new vessels. The aircraft plants would keep producing new bombers and fighters. The tank factories would keep rolling out Shermans and Cromwells and T-34s. The conveyor belt of Allied industrial production would continue its relentless operation, pouring resources into the war effort at a rate that Germany had never been able to match even at its peak. Richter would survive the Normandy campaign, though many of his men would not. He would retreat across France through that summer and fall, participating in the fighting withdrawal that would eventually carry the remnants of the Wehrmacht back to the Rhine and beyond. He would watch the Allied armies grow larger and more powerful while his own forces became smaller and weaker. He would see the Luftwaffe disappear from the skies entirely. He would see panzer divisions reduced to battle groups reduced to companies reduced to platoons of infantry with no armour support at all. He would be there in the Ardennes in December when Hitler launched his last desperate offensive, throwing the final reserves into an attack that briefly pushed back the American lines before collapsing for lack of fuel and supplies. He would see the remnants of that attack retreating through Belgium and Luxembourg, leaving behind yet another field of destroyed tanks and dead soldiers. He would cross back into Germany itself in early 1945, fighting now not for victory, but simply to delay the inevitable, to buy a few more days or weeks before the final collapse. And through all of it, the memory of that June morning would stay with him. The image of a horizon filled with ships, more ships than should have been possible, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it rendered resistance meaningless. That was the moment when the war ended, though the dying would continue for another 11 months. That was the moment when illusion shattered against reality, when propaganda dissolved in the face of undeniable evidence. In later years, when historians would analyse the outcome of the Second World War, they would point to many factors. The strategic errors of the Nazi leadership, the resistance of subject peoples, the courage of the Allied soldiers, the code-breaking efforts that gave the Allies crucial intelligence advantages. All of these things were real and important, but underlying all of them, enabling all of them, was the simple, overwhelming fact of industrial capacity. The Allied nations, led by the United States, had mobilized their economies for total war in a way that the Axis powers could never match. American GDP in 1944 was roughly equal to that of all the other major combatants combined. The United States produced more steel, more aluminum, more oil, more food than Germany, Japan, and Italy together could manage. And crucially, American factories were safe from attack, protected by oceans that enemy forces could not cross, free to operate at maximum capacity 24 hours a day without fear of bombing raids or sabotage. The same was largely true for Britain and the Soviet Union by 1944, their industrial centres either out of range of German forces or protected by air defences that could make daylight bombing prohibitively expensive. Germany, in contrast, had its industrial capacity steadily degraded by the combined bomber offensive. The round-the-clock bombing by British night forces and American day forces disrupted production, destroyed facilities, killed workers, and forced the diversion of enormous resources to air defence. By D-Day, something like a third of all German artillery production was going to anti-aircraft guns, rather than to weapons that could be used against ground forces. Hundreds of thousands of men were tied up in air defence roles, operating searchlights and flak batteries, men who could have been fighting on the front lines if not for the constant need to defend against Allied bombers. The German economy, despite the best efforts of Albert Speer and the Armaments Ministry, was fighting a losing battle against arithmetic. You couldn't win a war of production when the enemy had more of everything. More raw materials, more factory capacity, more workers, more engineers, more electrical power, more transportation infrastructure. Germany's industrial base, impressive as it had been in 1939, was simply too small to compete once the Allied economies fully mobilized for war production. And so the young men like Richter's soldiers, brave and skilled and professional, were sent into battle with equipment that couldn't be adequately maintained for lack of spare parts, supported by artillery that was rationing ammunition, defended by an air force that had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, supplied by a logistical system that was breaking down under the strain. They fought as well as anyone could fight under those circumstances, but courage and skill could not overcome such fundamental material disadvantages. The tragedy, from Richter's perspective, was that this outcome had been foreseeable from the beginning. Anyone with access to production statistics and the ability to think clearly about their implications should have understood that Germany could not win a long war against the combined might of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. The only path to German victory had required a series of quick, decisive campaigns that would knock opponents out of the war before they could fully mobilize. That strategy had worked against France in 1940 and against several smaller nations. It had failed against Britain and had catastrophically failed against the Soviet Union. Once the war became a contest of attrition, a grinding match where both sides threw resources and men into the meat grinder and waited to see who could sustain the losses longer, Germany's defeat became mathematically certain. The only questions were how long it would take and how many people would die before that certainty became reality. Every informed person in the German High Command must have understood this by 1943 at the latest. Yet they continued the war anyway, sending soldiers like Richter and his men to fight battles they could not win in service of a cause that was already lost. The moral implications of that decision were something Richter would wrestle with for the rest of his life. What was the proper response when you realized you were serving an evil cause in a war that could not be won? To keep fighting because duty demanded it? To surrender or desert? To resist actively? To sabotage and undermine? He had chosen to continue following orders, to be a professional soldier doing a soldier's job, and he would never be entirely sure whether that had been the right choice or merely the easiest one. But these were thoughts for later, for quiet moments of reflection in a future that still seemed impossibly distant. In the immediate aftermath of D-Day, there was no time for philosophy or soul-searching. There was only the next position to defend, the next order to follow, the next day to survive. The war continued its grinding course, and soldiers like Richter continued to fight, not because they believed in victory, but because they didn't know what else to do, because the machinery of war, once set in motion, was nearly impossible to stop until it had exhausted itself completely. When the end finally came, in May of 1945, with the surrender of all German forces and the complete collapse of the Third Reich, Richter would feel not relief but a strange emptiness. The cause he had fought for, flawed and evil as it had been, had at least given his life a structure and a purpose. Its absence left a void that would take years to fill. He would spend those years trying to rebuild some kind of normal life in a Germany that had been utterly transformed, destroyed and occupied and divided. He would have to confront what his country had done during the war years, the systematic murder and atrocity that went far beyond the normal brutality of combat. He would have to find a way to live with his own choices and actions. But he would always remember that morning in June when he had watched the invasion fleet appear from the fog and had understood in a single terrible moment what it meant. The Reich was doomed. All the propaganda, all the promises of final victory, all the talk of wonder weapons and fanatical resistance, it was all just noise meant to obscure a truth that was apparent to anyone willing to look clearly. Germany had started a war it could not win against enemies it could not defeat, and the price for that arrogance was being paid in the blood of millions. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, standing in his observation post on the coast of Normandy with powerful binoculars pressed against his face, watching an armada that filled the sea from horizon to horizon, that understanding came not as a gradual realization, but as an immediate, visceral certainty. The war was over. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Everything that followed was just the mechanical process of transforming that certainty into concrete reality, of counting the costs and burying the dead and sorting through the rubble of broken cities and broken lives. The moment of decision had passed. The future had been determined. All that remained was to live through whatever time was left and to bear witness to the end. The deeper implications of what he had witnessed that morning would continue to unfold over the months and years that followed. In the immediate chaos of the battle and the retreat, there was no time for reflection or analysis. Survival demanded complete attention. The tactical situation consumed every moment and every thought. But later, in quieter times, Richter would think back to that dawn and understand that he had witnessed not just a military operation, but a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. For most of human history, wars had been decided by factors that existed on a human scale. The courage of individual soldiers, the tactical brilliance of commanders, the discipline of formations, the sharpness of swords, or the accuracy of arrows. Even in the age of gunpowder, even as technology advanced and armies grew larger, there remained a comprehensible relationship between effort and outcome. A brave soldier could make a difference. A clever tactic could swing a battle. Quality could compensate for quantity within reasonable limits. What Richter had witnessed on D-Day was the final evolution away from that human-scale warfare and towards something entirely different. This was industrialized combat, where the outcome was determined less by what happened on the battlefield than by what happened in factories thousands of miles away. The courage and skill of his men had been rendered essentially meaningless by the simple fact that the enemy could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Tactical brilliance was irrelevant when the enemy could afford to make mistakes and still win through sheer weight of material. This wasn't entirely new, of course. The American Civil War had hinted at it, the First World War had demonstrated it clearly. But D-Day and the subsequent Normandy campaign represented the apotheosis of industrial warfare, the point where the transformation was complete and undeniable. The soldiers on the beach were almost interchangeable parts in a vast machine. Their individual actions mattered locally in the immediate tactical situation, but strategically they were simply inputs into an equation that had already been solved by production managers and logistics officers. The psychological impact of this realization was profound and corrosive. Richter and the soldiers of his generation had been raised on stories of heroism and valor, on the idea that individual excellence could matter, that determination and skill could overcome obstacles. The entire edifice of military honor and tradition rested on the assumption that what soldiers did in combat had meaningful impact on outcomes. But if the war was really decided by factory output and shipping tonnage, if the battles were just theatre to play out a conclusion that had already been determined by economic capacity, then what was the point of any of it? What did honor mean when you were just a number in a production spreadsheet? These were the thoughts that haunted Richter during the long retreat across France and into Germany. He watched good soldiers die in pointless defensive actions that delayed the Allied advance by hours or perhaps days, but could never stop it. He watched officers plan clever tactics that worked exactly as intended and accomplished nothing of strategic value. He watched the Luftwaffe throw away its remaining pilots in attacks that were suicidally brave and completely ineffective. Every day brought fresh evidence that individual action was meaningless in the face of overwhelming systemic superiority. The German military had prided itself on tactical excellence, on the superior training and fighting spirit of its soldiers, on the quality of its officer corps. And all of that had been real. German soldiers generally were better trained than their Allied counterparts, especially in the early years of the war. German officers generally did show more tactical flexibility and initiative. German equipment, when it worked properly, was often technically superior. But none of it mattered enough to overcome a tenfold disadvantage in resources. This was perhaps the hardest lesson for professional soldiers like Richter to absorb. They had spent their entire careers in a system that valued excellence and expertise, that taught them that mastery of their craft would lead to success. To discover that their expertise was irrelevant, that they could do everything right and still lose because the enemy had more of everything, was to have the foundation of their professional identity stripped away. It was to realize that they were participants in a kind of warfare where professionalism itself had become obsolete. The political implications were equally troubling, though Richter was careful to keep such thoughts to himself during the war years. If victory or defeat was determined primarily by industrial capacity rather than by military virtue, then the whole Nazi ideology of racial superiority and will to power was exposed as hollow nonsense. The master race was being defeated not because they lacked courage or determination, but because they lacked factories. The triumph of the will was being crushed under the weight of mass production. All the propaganda about ideological purity and spiritual strength dissolved in the face of simple arithmetic. The Allied victory wasn't proving that democracy was morally superior to fascism, though it was. It wasn't demonstrating that free peoples fought harder than conscripts, though they often did. It was demonstrating that an economy based on free markets and distributed decision-making could outproduce a centrally planned economy built around the whims of a dictator. It was showing that the messy, inefficient process of democratic governance could mobilize resources more effectively than authoritarian command structures. These were lessons that the Nazi leadership had never been willing to learn, and that their ideology prevented them from even considering seriously. Germany had built an economy and a military around the assumption that quality would triumph over quantity, that a smaller number of superior tanks and planes and soldiers would defeat larger numbers of inferior ones. This assumption had worked against poorly organized opponents and in situations where German forces could concentrate their qualitative advantages. but against an enemy that had both quality and quantity, that could field equipment that was good enough in numbers large enough to be overwhelming, the German model had collapsed completely. The strategic bombing campaign provided a brutal illustration of this dynamic. German cities were defended by the most sophisticated air defense network ever created, with hundreds of thousands of dedicated personnel operating thousands of anti-aircraft guns and thousands of night fighters. The defences exacted a terrible toll on Allied bomber crews, with casualty rates that would have been considered unsustainable in any previous war. But the Allies sustained them anyway because they could replace the losses and Germany couldn't replace what was being destroyed. Every bomber that went down over Germany took its crew with it, tragic deaths that represented enormous investments in training and equipment. But there were more bombers and more crews behind them, and behind those were factories building more bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. For the German defenders, the situation was reversed. Every night fighter that was lost, every experienced pilot who was killed, represented an irreplaceable loss. The replacement aircraft coming from German factories were often built by slave labourers with inadequate materials, rushed through production with defects and weaknesses. The replacement pilots had fewer and fewer hours of training as the Luftwaffe tried to stretch its dwindling fuel supplies and its shrinking force of experienced instructors across an expanding need for new air crews. Quality declined while demand increased, a death spiral that had only one possible ending. By the time of D-Day, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved something that might have seemed impossible a few years earlier. It had made Germany's air defences so effective that they consumed resources that might otherwise have been used against ground forces, while simultaneously making Germany's offensive air capabilities so weak that the Luftwaffe was effectively a non-factor in ground combat. The Western Allies were free to operate their tactical aircraft with near impunity, while German ground forces had to defend against air attack without any realistic hope of air support. It was a strategic achievement that would have been impossible without the industrial capacity to sustain heavy bomber losses indefinitely. The same pattern played out with naval forces. Germany had invested heavily in submarine warfare, developing tactics and technology that made U-boats a serious threat to Allied shipping. The Battle of the Atlantic had been genuinely close in 1942 and early 1943, with German submarines sinking merchant vessels faster than the Allies could replace them. But the Allies had responded not by matching German submarine quality, but by overwhelming it with quantity. More escort vessels, more patrol aircraft, better detection technology deployed across the entire Atlantic. By 1944, the U-boat force was still dangerous but strategically defeated, unable to seriously threaten the flow of supplies across the Atlantic. The invasion fleet that Richter had watched approaching the Normandy coast had crossed an ocean that German naval forces could no longer effectively contest. The ground war followed the same inexorable logic. German Panther and Tiger tanks were superior in most technical respects to Allied armour. In situations where German tanks could choose when and where to fight, they often inflicted lopsided losses on Allied tank forces. But the Allies didn't need to win tank duels on favourable terms. They just needed to continue advancing, to keep pushing, to trade 3 or 4 Shermans for every Panther if necessary, because they had 3 or 4 Shermans to trade and could get more tomorrow. German tank losses couldn't be replaced at anything like the rate at which they occurred. Allied losses were replaced almost immediately by fresh tanks arriving from the endless convoy of supply ships. The infantry situation was similar, though less dramatic. German infantry divisions tended to be better trained and more experienced than their Allied counterparts, especially in defensive operations. German machine gunners and mortarmen were generally more skilled at their craft. German non-commissioned officers showed more initiative and tactical awareness. In individual engagements, German infantry often achieved favourable casualty ratios against Allied attackers. But it didn't matter because the Allies had more infantrymen to commit to the attack, and the casualties they took were replaced faster than Germany could replace its losses. Every American or British division that was worn down in combat could be rotated out of the line and rebuilt with fresh replacements. Every German division that was worn down stayed in the line until it ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. This was the fundamental mathematics of attrition warfare when one side had overwhelming material superiority. The side with more resources could afford to make mistakes, could afford to accept casualties, could afford to win ugly. The side with fewer resources had to play a perfect game just to slow down its inevitable defeat. And no one plays a perfect game for months and years on end, not when exhausted and outnumbered and fighting against enemies that control the air and can call down devastating firepower at will. Richter saw this play out at every level over the final year of the war. He saw battalion commanders making smart tactical decisions that achieved their immediate objectives but meant nothing strategically. He saw regimental operations that succeeded brilliantly but changed nothing about the overall trajectory of the campaign. He saw entire offensives, like the Ardennes attack in December 1944, that briefly created local tactical situations favourable to Germany before collapsing for lack of the fuel and supplies necessary to exploit success. The German military remained capable of effective tactical operations almost to the very end, but tactical operations meant nothing when the enemy could absorb tactical defeats and still advance through sheer weight of numbers. The human cost of this dynamic was staggering and tragic. Young men on both sides died in enormous numbers, each death a universe of loss for someone, for families and friends and communities. But the deaths were not equally meaningful in strategic terms. For the Allies, casualties were replaceable inputs into a military machine that had sufficient depth to absorb horrific losses and continue functioning. For Germany, every casualty represented a permanent degradation of capability that could never be restored. This asymmetry made the human tragedy even more bitter, turned every German defensive success into a Pyrrhic victory that consumed irreplaceable assets to achieve temporary delays. Richter thought about his own men, the soldiers who had served under his command in Normandy and in the subsequent fighting. Many of them were dead now, killed in actions that had achieved nothing of lasting value. Others were prisoners, sitting out the rest of the war in camps far from home. A few had been wounded badly enough to be evacuated and might actually survive. And a handful still served with him, the lucky or unlucky ones, depending on how you looked at it, still fighting because they didn't know what else to do and because desertion meant execution. What had their sacrifices accomplished? In the grand scheme, nothing. The outcome would have been the same whether they had fought brilliantly or poorly, whether they had been heroes or cowards. The industrial equation would have worked out the same way regardless of their individual actions. They had fought for a cause that was both evil and doomed, had given their lives and their youth and their future for a regime that had led them into disaster. The knowledge of this uselessness, this meaninglessness, was perhaps harder to bear than the physical hardships of combat or the fear of death. And yet they had fought, and fought well, because that was what soldiers did. Because duty demanded it, because their comrades depended on them, because the immediate tactical situation required action even when the strategic situation was hopeless. This was perhaps the deepest tragedy of the professional military mind, that it trained men to focus on their immediate responsibilities and objectives, even when the larger enterprise was revealed as futile. Richter could look at the strategic picture and understand with perfect clarity that the war was lost, that every day of continued resistance just added to the total of dead and destruction without changing the ultimate outcome. But he could not translate that understanding into action, could not bring himself to abandon his post, or surrender his men, or actively work to end the fighting. He continued following orders and doing his duty because that was what his entire life and training had prepared him to do. This psychological imprisonment was common among German officers in the final stages of the war. They knew the cause was lost, they knew the regime they served was monstrous, but they continued fighting anyway because they literally did not know how to do anything else, because their identity as soldiers and as men was so completely bound up with military service that to abandon it felt like a kind of death. They fought on in a peculiar state of cognitive dissonance, knowing intellectually that they should stop but unable emotionally to take that step. The propaganda machine continued trying to maintain hope and morale, even as the military situation became increasingly desperate. Soldiers were told about wonder weapons that would turn the tide of war, about revolutionary new technologies that would restore German superiority, about secret plans that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The V-weapons, the jet aircraft, the promises of atomic bombs or miraculous new defences. Some of these technologies were real, though none were developed soon enough or in sufficient numbers to matter. Others were pure fantasy, desperate lies told by a regime that had built its entire existence on lies and could not stop lying even as it collapsed. Richter had long since stopped believing in final victory or wonder weapons or any of the other comforting myths. He had seen the invasion fleet that morning in June and understood what it represented. No technological breakthrough was going to change the fundamental imbalance in resources and production capacity. No tactical innovation was going to make up for the fact that the enemy had 10 times as much of everything. The war was over and had been over since that moment when the Armada appeared from the fog. Everything since then was just the playing out of a predetermined conclusion, the mechanical working out of an equation that had been solved before the first shot was fired on D-Day. As he moved through the final months of the war, retreating steadily back into Germany itself, watching the Reich shrink day by day, Richter became almost philosophical about the experience. There was a certain freedom in understanding that the outcome was no longer in doubt, that individual actions could not change the trajectory of events. It relieved him of the burden of trying to find some way to win, some tactical brilliance that might turn the tide. He could focus simply on the immediate task of keeping his men alive as long as possible, of conducting orderly retreats, of defending positions for as long as they could be held before falling back to the next position. These were concrete, achievable objectives that gave structure to the chaos. He found himself thinking about history, about all the other armies that had fought hopeless defensive campaigns against superior enemies, about the countless soldiers throughout human history who had found themselves in similar positions. How many of them had known, really known, deep in their bones, that they were fighting for a lost cause? How many had continued anyway, driven by duty or honour, or simply the lack of any better alternative? Military history celebrated the victors, the brilliant campaigns and decisive battles that changed the course of empires. But what about all the forgotten armies that fought skillfully and bravely and lost anyway because they were on the wrong side of a historical tide that individual courage could not reverse? The final collapse, when it came in the spring of 1945, was almost anticlimactic. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, were driving deep into Germany from both east and west. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. The panzer divisions were mostly memories, their tanks destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. The defences crumbled, not because German soldiers suddenly lost the will to fight, but because there was simply nothing left to fight with. Ammunition stocks were exhausted. Fuel was gone. Food was scarce. Replacement soldiers were teenage boys and old men with minimal training. The military machine had run out of resources and was grinding to a halt. When Richter finally surrendered to American forces in late April, it was with a sense of profound relief mixed with equally profound emptiness. The war was over. He had survived. But what had he survived for? His country was destroyed, occupied, divided. His career as a soldier was finished. The regime he had served, evil as it was, had at least provided structure and purpose to his life. Its absence left a void that he had no idea how to fill. The victors would later debate endlessly about the causes of the war, about the failures of appeasement and the moral questions of strategic bombing and the decisions made at various conferences and the roles of different leaders. Historians would write thousands of books analysing the military campaigns, arguing about decisions made and alternatives not taken. All of this was important and valuable. But for Richter, who had lived through it, who had stood on a bluff in Normandy and watched 7,000 ships appear from the fog, the essential truth was simpler and more brutal. The war had been decided by factories and shipyards, by production lines and supply chains, by the unglamorous work of millions of people who never fired a shot in anger, but whose labour made Allied victory inevitable. The soldiers, German and Allied both, had fought with courage and skill and determination. But their efforts had been marginal to an outcome that was determined by forces operating far from the battlefield. The Second World War had been the first truly industrial war where this dynamic was fully realised, where the connection between economic capacity and military outcome was impossible to ignore or obscure. It would not be the last such war, but it would remain the clearest example, the proof that in modern conflict between industrialised nations, the side with more factories wins.